All right, for the sake of demonstration, let's say I timed out my panels, and now I want to make scene numbers, and I want to add any digital camera moves or, Filippo, any transitions. So first, scene numbers. Scene numbers are created on a video track above everything else, and you'll see I've left room eventually, you know, for the different work in progress exports of each shot. But the way to do it is with this type tool. So hit T, and if you click in your frame, you'll see that, oh, that is white and you can't see anything. Let me go over to Effect Controls panel. But you'll see what happened just now. A lot happened right now. When I hit type and I clicked in here, it created this little clip in my timeline. I can move it up later. And when I double click on it, right, it'll bring it up to my effects controls window. So if you don't see it, you can also go to the window menu, go to effect controls. Double click. Now I can control the settings of what's on this clip. So you'll want to go to this text option, scroll it down, and for the sake of demonstration, let us change this to an obnoxious color that we can see, like neon green. So now I have, here's my text, and if I keep typing, this line will extend off screen. Okay, so that's not always helpful. And so instead of just clicking and typing, I'm going to suggest that you click and drag in the area that you want to type in. So I'm just going to delete these and try that again. So here's my type tool, and I just want scene numbers to exist in the bottom corner. So I'm just going to click and drag, and here's the area that I'm going to type in. And you'll see that it cuts off immediately. So click and drag is the way to go. So I'm just going to call this scene 1. Use a color that will be easy to see. It can be ugly. And so I always use like some neon color, because depending on what my storyboards look like, it just needs to stand out. And then you can use this arrow tool to move the placement around. And then in the effects panel, you have different options. You can make it centered. You can make it, you know, all the things that you would expect in a word processing program. Here's the color that you can change, the fill color. And then this might be helpful. So usually I'll put a stroke on scene numbers just to make sure it's visible. So since most of my boards are white, I'm going to put a black stroke around it and increase that width. And so now, no matter what color my background is, I will always be able to see the scene number. And this is just helpful, especially for when you're screening your work in progress to the class, or someday screening it to your director and producer, screening it to your client. Having the scene numbers burned into the video file will just make it easier to talk about revisions and what you want to change and all of that. So putting the stroke on there just adds to the clarity. The other thing I want to mention is, you see how I have this bounding box? This is called title safe, and you can turn that on and off by hitting this wrench button, coming down to safe margins and turning that either on or off. So this might be left over from the days of not only broadcast production, but also the days of the old tube TVs, where it had a border that would actually cut into the size of the image. Nowadays, if you have flat screen TVs, it pretty much shows you the entire 16:9 image. It won't really crop the edges. But back in the day, there was no standard. And so you wanted to make sure all text was away from the edges of the frame, and also all of your important action would be included. So that's why there was 2. And so I just think it's a good practice to keep any scene numbers, any text, just within that bound. It's yeah, I think it's just a leftover habit, but still good to be aware of. So I use that to line up my scene numbers. And so then you'll just scrub through your boards, and whenever your camera changes angle, that's a new scene. Okay, so my wide shot is pretty long. And the way to make a new scene, I think the easiest is to just copy and paste this clip, copy, paste. I pasted it where I want it to end, so I'll move it like this, stretch it back, fill in that gap, and then if I double click on this, double click here, I can change this to scene 2. And now I have scene 1 and scene 2. So I find that to be the easiest way to make scene numbers with the title tool, with the type tool in Premiere Pro. So I'll copy and paste that again, fill in this gap, change the number to 3. And then 3, scene 3 ends here. Let me just show you how to do some quick keyframes to create these camera moves. So you'll notice that the original size of my storyboards, if I right click on this, reveal in project, this shows up which file it is in my project window. If I click on this and look up here, I actually exported these boards larger than 1920 by 1080. And I did that so that I could digitally add camera moves without the image losing too much quality. So that's something to consider, and it just gives you flexibility to digitally plan out your shots. So you might want to consider exporting your storyboards larger. So if I click on this and I see, double click, it's loaded in my source view, and then I come over to effect controls, and I'm dealing with this clip. So you get some of these parameters like in After Effects. This will feel familiar to After Effects. I can control the scale, position on the x-axis, position on the y-axis, so on and so forth, even rotation. All these things, even opacity, all these things. And similar to After Effects, we can create keyframes and then create some just basic animation on here. So here's the line.
Killer. Actually, that part's pretty literal. They're still finding.
Okay, so he says,
You know, must be why they call him the lady killer. Actually, that part's pretty literal.
Okay, so that's why they call him the lady killer. Then it cuts to a close-up of the poster, and then we just want to like zoom in and emphasize his nickname as the lady killer. So I'm going to set up this shot. It's going to start wide, so I'm going to scale that down, and if I go to my arrow tool, I have to select this motion attribute in order for me to physically move it around. Otherwise, I'll just have to rely on scrolling these different parameters. So we're going to start wide like this. I'm going to set a keyframe by enabling the stopwatch, just like in After Effects. And then
actually, that part's pretty literal.
That part's pretty literal. I'm going to then add a keyframe here and then change my parameters here and then here. And actually, in light of what I just told you about title safe and safe margins, I'm actually going to not zoom in so far, just in case anything gets clipped off. And so I'm just gonna scale it in like that. And so now I have this digital camera move. If I play it back.
You know, must be why they call him the lady killer. Actually, that part's pretty literal. They're still finding victims' heads and shoulders. Knees and toes? Knees and toes all over Mexico.
And that'll be very clear when I'm watching the animatic, like, oh, okay, we're gonna zoom in. So animatic camera moves can be pretty rough and dirty. It can just be a basic linear keyframe, but just like in After Effects, you can control the smoothness and the easing and easing out of keyframes. If you highlight them, select it, and then right click, and then you go to temporal interpolation. So right click, temporal interpolation, and then we can add an ease in, ease out, or we can do a different kind of easing in, easing out. So there's different options there. This part will remind you of After Effects. And then, so speaking of transitions and just other digital placeholders for compositing or camera moves, transitions, the quick way to do it is to select the end of your frame or your clip, right click, and then do apply default transitions. So the default is a cross dissolve.
And toes all over Mexico.
And it shows up as this little icon. You can select it individually. You get a few options here in your effects control panel. You also can edit the timing by dragging this little red bracket. As soon as you hover over it, you can extend the cross dissolve or you can make it very short. And you can do the same with audio. So if I click there, right click, apply default, then there's a default constant power type of fade out.
Those all over Mexico.
But you can also have access to all of the effects available. So go up to Window, View, select your effects panel. It might show up here. Might take a second to load, but here are all of the different kinds of transitions, effects for both video and audio here. So you can take one of these. You can do a page peel between two clips. That's what you needed. You can also just physically click and drag it over your clip where you want it to go.
Call him the lady killer. Actually, that part's pretty literal.
And you can edit like that. If you want to explore color correction or even color effects, you can come here under video effects, color correction. Lumetri color is what you can use to color correct footage. So your rendered colored animation or even footage that you're working with. But for us, probably just something basic to convey an idea. So if like the lights dim or it gets dark because it's ominous, I can throw this effect over this clip, brightness and contrast. You'll see if I click this clip, all of the effects and attributes appear in the effects control panel. And under brightness and contrast, I can make it darker and, play with things like that. So
they call him the lady killer. Actually, that part's pretty literal.
And actually, I can also keyframe this as well. So if I add keyframe, select stopwatch, and then I want it to match with where the camera move starts. So just hold down Shift and drag this little mover, and it'll snap to any other keyframes you have. And then you can time it exactly. So I'm adding new keyframes here and resetting it at this point in time. So now I have a color effect that coincides with my camera move.
So I have a question. Like, is there like a transition and like zooming in Toon Boom, or do we have to like export every single scene and like make it into a whole film in a Premiere Pro?
Yeah, that's a great question. Harmony allows you to do a lot of these same effects. Ultimately, it comes down to what makes the most sense for you personally and for your project. And so on the TV shows that I've worked on, usually the animator will animate the camera move because they want to control it with the action. And so as an editor, I would get the shot with the camera move already built in. So what that means for you, Brian, is that you might want to animate the camera move in Harmony or whatever animation software you're using. That being said, because you're also the editor of your film, you might realize that it's easier for you to do it in Premiere and not in Harmony. There's no right or wrong. You can do it in either place, and I think it'll depend on what makes sense. For animatics though, it is just really helpful to be able to do camera moves on your storyboard panels, right? Especially because of like your film has a lot of action and the pacing is going to be important and camera moves are important, right? So it's good that you can choreograph that in Premiere, but you might want to animate that in the same software that you're using. That's also another reason why having your animatics be as accurate as possible is important, because if you're timing camera moves too in Premiere, then in animation you can animate that camera and not think about it later.